Have you ever noticed that the deepest battles you fight are not with other people, but with yourself? Not the kind of conflict that leaves bruises or scars, but the silent judgment that lingers inside your chest. Perhaps you've walked through nights when the world seemed indifferent to your pain, when every smile around you felt like a reminder of how far you had fallen. And yet, here you are, listening, breathing, surviving. That in itself is proof of something extraordinary. Think about the moments when you carried shame so heavy it felt impossible to face the morning, or the times when betrayal left you questioning not only others, but your own worth. These are the moments that test the very architecture of your soul. We often believe survival is only about food, shelter, or the body's endurance. But the hardest survival is invisible. It is enduring the judgment of your own conscience, walking through the fire of disillusionment, and not letting it consume you completely. Niccolò Machiavelli, often remembered as the ruthless strategist, wrote not only about power but also about resilience in the face of cruel reality. He understood that life itself places us under constant trial. You may not have noticed it, but if you are still standing after facing disappointment, rejection, or failure, you have already survived what Machiavelli might call the most painful tribunal, the one where the soul is forced to confront its naked truth. So here's the question. What if the suffering you thought would break you was actually evidence that you were being refined? What if your endurance is the clearest sign that you have passed through the judgment of the soul and come out on the other side stronger, though scarred? This is not about easy victories or happy endings. It is about the quiet proof that you have already faced what many spend their whole lives avoiding: the confrontation with your own vulnerability. That is the first evidence and perhaps the most powerful. Before we move forward, let me ask you, can you recognize one moment in your life when you thought you would not endure, but somehow you did? Share it in the comments. And if you want to keep walking this path of reflection with us, remember to subscribe and like this video. It helps us build a community of people who seek not shallow comfort, but deeper truth. What if we paused for a moment and imagined an alternate version of your life? Picture yourself in that very season of darkness you once endured, the heartbreak, the rejection, the betrayal, but instead of sinking into despair, you were able to see beyond it. Imagine if, in the midst of the trial, you had known with absolute certainty that survival was not just possible, but inevitable. How different would your nights have felt? How much lighter would the burden have been, knowing that your soul was already stronger than the weight pressing against it? It's a fascinating exercise to place yourself back in that space and then reconstruct the story with new eyes. Because here's the hidden truth. The fact that you are here, listening now, proves that the worst-case scenario you once feared did not destroy you. The end you imagined was never the real end. It was only a moment in the larger arc of your journey. Machiavelli reminds us that human beings often imagine disasters far more terrifying than reality itself. Our minds build prisons of fear long before the first stone is laid. Yet survival shows us something different. It reveals that our capacity to endure is greater than our capacity to despair. So, let me invite you to another what if. What if you could approach your next trial not with dread but with a quiet conviction? I have endured before, and I will endure again. What if the memory of your survival could become the foundation for a new kind of courage? Imagine how differently you would carry yourself into challenges, less like a victim waiting for the blow, and more like a warrior who has already proven their resilience in battle. Take a moment and let that image sink in. You are not someone defined by defeat. You are someone who has already lived through fire. The scars are not marks of weakness, but evidence that you endured the tribunal of your soul and walked out alive. The exercise is simple yet profound. Revisit your darkest memory, but instead of focusing on the pain, focus on the fact that you survived. Reframe it not as a story of collapse, but as a story of endurance. That shift in imagination alone can change how you face tomorrow's trials. We live in a culture that constantly whispers the same story. Strength means smiling, moving on quickly, and pretending nothing can touch you. Weakness, on the other hand, is painted as the cracks, the tears, the nights of despair. But what if that picture is upside down? What if true strength has nothing to do with keeping your mask intact, and everything to do with the moments when you allowed yourself to shatter, and then chose to gather the pieces back again? Here is the disruptive truth. Survival is not glamorous. It is not the cinematic victory where the hero walks away without scars. Survival is raw, messy, and often invisible to everyone but you. And yet that invisible endurance is more powerful than the loudest displays of control. When you pass through the judgment of your own soul, the victory is not that the pain disappears. It's that you are still here despite the pain. Machiavelli himself warned against illusions of permanence and comfort. He argued that life is ruled not by certainty, but by fortune, a force as unpredictable as the wind. If you expect stability, you will be crushed by its absence. But if you accept that instability is the natural state of existence, then endurance becomes the true sign of wisdom. So, let's break a common belief: the idea that your survival must be neat, polished, and free of weakness. The reality is that your scars, your nights of collapse, and your internal battles are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of authenticity. They reveal that you did not bypass the trial, but went through it fully and still refused to vanish. This perspective shift matters, because once you realize that survival is not about avoiding pain, but enduring it without losing your humanity, you stop envying those who seem untouched by hardship. You begin to see that their untouched surface might actually hide a fragile foundation, while your scars reveal a strength forged through fire. So ask yourself, what illusions about strength have you been carrying? Have you believed that survival meant hiding the evidence of struggle? Or can you now see that your very cracks are the clearest testimony that you have endured the judgment most people spend their lives running from? Niccolò Machiavelli is often remembered as the cold strategist of power, but beneath the surface of his writings lies something deeper, a relentless confrontation with reality as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. He insisted that fortune, the unpredictable forces of life, would always test human beings in ways they could not control. And yet, he also believed that resilience could be cultivated, that human virtue was measured not by avoiding hardship, but by facing it with eyes open. Machiavelli's reflections were not born in comfort. He wrote his most famous works while exiled, stripped of influence, and watching his political world collapse around him. For him, survival was not an abstract idea. It was the bitter reality of losing everything and still having to live with himself. His insight reminds us that survival is not about the absence of loss, but about carrying loss without letting it erase who you are. Modern psychology echoes this truth. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who endured Nazi concentration camps, described survival not as escaping suffering but as finding meaning within it. He wrote that those who could locate even a small sense of purpose, something beyond themselves, were the ones most likely to endure unimaginable pain. In other words, survival is not simply biological, it is existential. When you connect these two voices, Machiavelli and Frankl, you begin to see a pattern. Both understood that the hardest trials of life are not fought against others, but within the soul itself. Both testify that survival is not glamorous or easy, but profoundly human. And here lies the authority of your own life. You may not have written philosophy in exile or survived the brutality of a concentration camp, but you have walked through your own deserts. You have endured betrayals, disappointments, and silent nights of despair. That is not less real than history's grand examples. It is your personal testament. So, when you doubt whether you are strong, remember that the wisdom of great thinkers stands beside you. Machiavelli would tell you that fortune will always strike, but your virtue lies in standing after the blow. Frankl would remind you that your survival has meaning, even if you cannot see it yet. And your own story proves that you have already lived this truth. The evidence of survival is not found in denial of suffering, but in the way you carried it. And whether you realize it or not, that makes you part of a long tradition of souls who have endured the hardest tribunal of all. There's a strange paradox in the way suffering works. On the surface, it seems like a singular, isolated event. A breakup, a betrayal, a failure, a loss. But if you look more carefully, you begin to see that these experiences are not random. They follow invisible patterns that shape the way we respond, the way we build our inner world, and the way we walk forward. One of the most common patterns is silence. People rarely speak of their deepest wounds, not because they are insignificant, but because they feel unspeakable. You walk through your daily life carrying pain that no one else notices. And yet, that silent endurance is part of the trial of the soul. The world may overlook it, but you know the weight you carried. That alone is evidence of survival, continuing to live, even when no one acknowledged the storm you were navigating. Another pattern is self-judgment. Long after the event itself is over, you replay it in your mind, blaming yourself, questioning what you should have done differently. This internal tribunal is harsher than anything others might say. Machiavelli noted that people often destroy themselves not through external enemies but through their own illusions and missteps. The painful truth is that the enemy within can wound more deeply than any adversary outside. Recognizing this is the first step toward liberation. There is also the pattern of resilience disguised as weakness. Have you noticed how society often labels tears, doubts, and hesitations as flaws? And yet, those very expressions are the mechanisms through which the soul processes survival. What looks like collapse is often the body and mind reorganizing themselves after impact. If you are still breathing, still searching, still asking questions, then you are already proving that what seemed like weakness was in fact part of your strength. By exposing these invisible dynamics, silence, self-judgment, disguised resilience, you begin to recognize yourself in a clearer mirror. You are not alone in these experiences. They are universal. The specifics differ, but the underlying patterns belong to all humanity. So, pause for a moment. Can you see these patterns in your own story? The quiet storms no one saw, the harsh voice inside your mind, the moments you thought you were broken but were in fact healing. Naming them is the first step in seeing the truth, that survival is not accidental. It is the very structure of your soul at work. Sometimes survival doesn't need a long explanation. It needs only a few words that pierce through the fog like a blade. Let these phrases stay with you, echoing when doubt tries to steal your clarity. Scars are not stains, they are signatures of survival. Too often we hide the marks of what we've endured, as if they were signs of failure. But every scar, visible or hidden, is proof that you faced something that could have destroyed you and yet you remained. Endurance is louder than despair. Pain screams, but survival whispers. The quiet persistence of showing up day after day, even when nothing makes sense, speaks with more power than any breakdown ever could. Your soul has already passed its test. You may still doubt yourself, replaying every wrong turn, but the simple fact that you are alive and listening right now is evidence that you have already endured the tribunal of the soul. The verdict is in, you survived. Collapse is not the end, it is the threshold of rebuilding. When everything inside you felt shattered, it wasn't the conclusion of your story. It was the ground clearing itself for a different foundation. Survival begins where illusions end. These are not just sentences. They are reminders you can carry in your pocket for the days when the storm feels louder than your strength. Words have the power to crystallize experience, to take what feels chaotic and frame it into something you can hold. Machiavelli understood this when he wrote about fortune and virtue. His words cut through illusions to reveal truths that remain centuries later. So ask yourself, which of these statements resonates most deeply with your own survival story? Which phrase could you write on the walls of your mind as a reminder that you have already walked through fire? Remember, survival is not about denying weakness. It's about naming it and realizing that even weakness did not undo you. These words are not a shield to hide behind, but a torch to carry into the next dark corridor. And sometimes a single phrase, spoken at the right time, is enough to remind you of what you have already proven. You have endured. Here is a paradox that few dare to confront. The very moments you felt most fragile may have been the clearest proof of your strength. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? Society teaches us to equate strength with unshakable confidence, with stoic silence, with an armor that never cracks. But if you examine your own life, you'll see that your endurance came not from perfection, but from the times you allowed yourself to feel broken and still chose to continue. Machiavelli, often accused of cynicism, actually grasped this paradox. He wrote that fortune favors those who adapt, not those who remain rigid. What is fragility if not the willingness to bend, to weep, to admit the pain? And what is strength if not the ability to rise again after bending? True resilience is not the absence of collapse. It is the rebirth that follows it. Think of it this way. Glass shatters under pressure, but steel, though hard, can break when it refuses to bend. The human soul, however, is something in between. It bends, it cracks, it even falls apart. Yet somehow it weaves itself back together, often in a form more complex and beautiful than before. This is the paradox. You endured because you were fragile enough to feel and strong enough to heal. Another duality emerges here: despair and hope. At your lowest point, despair seemed absolute, and yet, without you realizing, hope hid in the very act of survival. If you had truly lost all hope, you would not have taken the next breath or the next step. Hope did not appear as a blazing fire. It appeared as the smallest ember, almost invisible, but just enough to keep you alive. That ember was your strength, disguised as fragility. So when you reflect on your survival, do not dismiss the nights you cried, the days you felt incapable, or the moments you collapsed. Those were not failures. They were paradoxical victories. The spaces where your soul proved that fragility and strength are not opposites, but partners in endurance. The question now is, can you embrace this paradox as part of your identity? Can you stop seeing fragility as weakness and instead recognize it as the very path that carried you through the judgment of your soul? Survival is not just about making it through a storm. It is about discovering who you have become because of it. When you endure the tribunal of your soul, the reward is rarely immediate. Often it appears later, in the way you understand others, in the patience you develop, in the quiet confidence that cannot be faked. The prize of survival is not loud, it is subtle, but profound. Think back to your darkest trial. At the time, all you could see was loss. But now, when you revisit that season, don't you notice how much sharper your vision has become? You can recognize lies faster. You can sense hidden motives. You can read the unspoken pain in others' eyes. This is one of the hidden rewards, a depth of perception that only suffering can teach. Machiavelli spoke of virtù, not morality in the conventional sense, but the strength of character to face fortune as it truly is. Your survival has given you this virtù. It has stripped away illusions, forcing you to accept life's cruelty, but also to see its beauty with clearer eyes. And that clarity is a form of power, quieter than dominance, but stronger than naivety. Another reward is empathy. You know how it feels to be broken, so you no longer dismiss the struggles of others. Instead, you carry a kind of silent solidarity with those who suffer. This doesn't make you sentimental, it makes you real. People sense it, even if you never speak of it. They trust you because they recognize you have walked through fire. And perhaps the greatest reward of all is freedom. Once you have faced your deepest fear and survived, you are no longer held hostage by the illusion that you must avoid pain at all costs. You realize that pain has already touched you, and you lived. That realization loosens fear's grip on your future. You walk differently, not careless, but freer. So here is the invitation. Recognize these rewards in your own life. Do not overlook them simply because they arrived quietly. Ask yourself, what did I gain by surviving what I thought would destroy me? The answer to that question may reveal that survival was not just endurance, it was transformation. Survival may feel chaotic when you're in the middle of it, but beneath the surface it follows a deeper structure, one that philosophy and psychology have both tried to map. When you look closely, you see that endurance is not random. It rests on three invisible pillars that form the architecture of the soul. The first pillar is acceptance of reality. Machiavelli insisted that those who deal with life as it is, not as they wish it to be, are the ones who prevail. Denial wastes energy, but acceptance channels strength. When you finally stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What now?" survival takes root. The second pillar is meaning beyond the self. Viktor Frankl discovered in the camps that those who lived for something larger than themselves, love, faith, purpose, We're the ones who endured suffering that should have been unbearable. When your life is tied only to comfort, suffering feels like annihilation. But when your life is tied to something transcendent, suffering becomes a passage, not an ending. The third pillar is the paradox of resilience. As we explored earlier, resilience is not rigidity, but flexibility. To bend without breaking, to collapse without disappearing, to admit fragility while still choosing life. That is the hidden structure of strength. Without this paradox, survival becomes brittle. With it, survival becomes enduring. When you combine these three pillars, acceptance, meaning, and paradox, you realize that survival is not an accident, but a process. It is the soul's natural response when given the right foundation. Your own story, whether you see it clearly or not, fits into this framework. At some point, you accepted what you could not change. At some point, you found a reason, however small, to keep moving. And at some point, you allowed yourself to bend instead of shatter. Machiavelli might call this virtue. Frankl might call it the search for meaning. Psychology might call it resilience. But whatever the name, it is the same truth. Survival is a discipline of the soul. So reflect for a moment. Which of these three pillars carried you the most? Was it acceptance, meaning, or the paradox of resilience? Recognizing it can help you not only honor your past survival, but also prepare for the trials yet to come. So here we are, at the end of this journey. We began by asking whether survival itself might be the clearest evidence that you have already endured the most painful tribunal of the soul. And now, after exploring illusions, paradoxes, hidden patterns, and timeless wisdom, the answer is undeniable. You are living proof. You survived what you thought would destroy you. That is not a minor detail of your biography. It is the very foundation of your character. But here is the question I want to leave with you. What will you do with that survival? It is not enough to simply exist after the storm. The real challenge is to let endurance shape you into someone who walks differently, less afraid, more compassionate, more rooted in truth. Machiavelli would remind you that fortune is unpredictable and another storm will come. But now you know, survival is already in your nature. You carry the evidence within you. This is where the transformation happens, when you stop seeing yourself only as a victim of hardship and begin to see yourself as someone refined by it. Your scars are no longer just memories of pain. They are the proof that you endured the judgment of the soul and refused to vanish. That recognition is not meant to inflate your pride, but to deepen your gratitude. Because what you survived has given you clarity, empathy, and freedom that cannot be faked. So I invite you to pause and meditate on this. What has your survival taught you about yourself that you might not have learned any other way? And how can you live differently now, knowing that you have already faced your inner tribunal and lived to tell the story? If these reflections resonated with you, I would love to hear your voice in the comments. Share one lesson your survival has revealed. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to endure their own silent trial. And if you believe in building a community where we confront truth, not with fear but with courage, subscribe and join us here. Together, we can keep exploring not shallow comfort, but the deeper strength that only real survival brings. Your survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new one. And the world needs the wisdom that only you, scarred but still standing, can offer.